or two systems of courts?
10, Mississippi.
Do the 14th. All right, Secretary of State.
Secretary of State
Deals with everything outside of America.
deals with everything outside.
Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy, where last time we broke down the articles of the Constitution. We kind of looked at the whole document. But in this lesson, we are going to look at what are called the principles of the Constitution. Now, principles are like the major themes. Okay, we see a definition for a principle here. It's a fundamental truth, a concept, or a foundation. And foundations are a good way to think of these. Remember, foundations are things that you build on top of. And these principles are not only principles for the Constitution, but kind of what the whole government and our country are built upon. Now, if you Google principles of the Constitution, you're likely to get a few slightly different lists, but most of them have similar principles. Now, I'm going to give you mine in a minute. But before we do, let's take a look at one of the many benchmarks that these principles can be found in. And I say many because these are themes that will be used throughout this course. And each one of these principles is very likely to be an answer on your state exam. So one of the benchmarks that has two of our principles in it says to describe how the Constitution limits the powers of government through separation of powers and checks and balances. And so we see separation of powers and checks and balances, which are two of our 6 principles. But before we look at the rest of the list, just a reminder, teacher, that this PowerPoint as well as a variety of lessons are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just search for Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy. Okay, so let's get our list of the principles and make sure you write these down. Again, I recommend 2-column notes. Put the principle in the left and your description in the right. Okay, so first off, we've worked with 3 of these. And the first one's popular sovereignty, separation of powers, checks and balances, limited government, and federalism. Oh, and by the way, I guess I have 5. I think I said 6 before. Okay, but that is the list of the principles that we are going to work with. And again, it's 5. Okay, so I'm going to start with limited government because this is the principle that all of the other ones fall under. Limited government goes back to the theme we've been talking about, which was the fear of the government having too much power. And by the way, this is something that we still debate today. We talked about our first constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which was made weak on purpose. And I hope you're noticing a pattern here. Okay, controlling power was the chief concern of the framers to the Constitutional Convention. Why? Remember, they lived under a king, and the idea that power was something that was abused was just ingrained in not just the framers, but throughout the Enlightenment worlds, down to the people. Okay, this idea that power can corrupt people. Okay, so the concept of, or principle of limited government demonstrates what was really a central theme of these principles. Giving one person or a small group of people too much power is dangerous. Now, in this case, the fear was not so much the state governments. After all, these were made up of locals, and these people all knew each other. This was a fear of the national government. So the theme of limited government goes with the idea that, yes, this new constitution was giving the national government a lot of new powers, but they could only do what was listed in the Constitution. And this is an idea we're going to come back to not just in this video, but in a lot of upcoming videos. Now, popular sovereignty we discussed in a previous video when we learned about the preamble to the Constitution and those famous first 3 words, "we the people." We talked about how popular means people and sovereignty equals power. So popular sovereignty means that the people have the power in the U.S. federal government and the state government for that matter. Now, how do the people exercise this power? Well, they vote. We vote for leaders who are going to do what we want, or else we will vote for someone else. So think of popular sovereignty as people power, with our motto being, "we the people." The next principle of the Constitution is separation of powers, and we learned about this when we discussed the French Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu. Montesquieu suggested breaking down the powers that had previously been held by kings for the most part, and those powers are to make laws, enforce laws, and judge laws. And this was a huge change when we created the three branches. Okay, we have the U.S. legislative branch, which we call Congress, and they have the power to make laws. We have the executive branch headed by a president to enforce the laws, and a judicial branch with the Supreme Court to judge or interpret the laws. Now, this seems obvious to us today because we've had this government for over 225 years. Okay, so this is a concept that has survived the test of time, but back in 1789, this relatively new idea. So our next principle is checks and balances. This goes hand in hand with separation of powers. It really just takes it to a next level by giving the three branches the power to keep the other two branches in check. If one branch is doing something that is quote-unquote bad, the other branches have the ability to stop them. So let's look at an example of checks and balances. And these are probably the most important checks and the ones that you really need to memorize for your state exam. And they have to do with the power of making laws. After all, making laws is the major job of governments, and it provides the most opportunity for officials to abuse their power. So, as hopefully you've caught on at this point, the job of the legislature, aka Congress, is to make laws. Now, in an upcoming video, we're going to really look at the lawmaking process in more detail. But for this lesson, you just need to know that a law as made by Congress is not actually a law at first. It's called a bill. So when Congress creates a bill, it is sent over to the president for his approval. He can either sign the bill, making it a law, or he can veto it, which means he disapproves of it. So if he vetoes it, that is his check. Okay, now usually this is the end of it, and Congress would have to try to make a new law. However, they can override his veto if 2/3 of both houses vote in favor of the bill. It becomes a law. However, this is very difficult and rare, but this is something we'll look at later this year. Now, what can the judicial branch do? Well, they can declare a law unconstitutional. If they declare a law unconstitutional, they strike it down. Okay, they get rid of the law, and this is their check on the legislative branch. And by the way, this is a way that they've gotten rid of some horrible laws like segregation in school, and we're going to look more at that when we learn about the Supreme Court in a lot greater detail. Okay, so our final principle is federalism. And federalism is the concept in which power is shared between the national government and the state governments. And this goes back to what we discussed at the beginning of the video. Remember that when the Articles of Confederation was written, a lot of state governments were reluctant to give the federal government too much power. Well, as you know, the states needed to compromise and give the national government the power to collect taxes and enforce their laws, and they even created 2 new branches. However, this was not a full license to give them all of the powers that the states had. The Constitution made it very clear that the national government would only have the powers that were listed in the Constitution. We'll learn that these powers listed in the Constitution for the national government are known as enumerated or delegated powers. For instance, only the national government can declare war or make treaties or agreements with other countries. But it's the state's job to deal with things like marriage and driver's licenses, education, and elections. Again, we're going to learn more about this in an upcoming video, but you need to remember that federalism is the concept that the national government and the state governments need to work together, and that they have different powers that are made clear by the Constitution. So let's review. Which principle implies that the people are the ones with the power over the government? That's right, popular sovereignty. Next, which principle describes how each branch directly limits the power of the other branches? That's right, checks and balances. Okay, which principle states that the national government and the state government share powers? You remember that one, we just did it. Federalism. Which principle describes that the national government only has the powers listed in the Constitution? There's two that kind of work for this, but we're going for limited government. Which principle is about sharing powers between the different branches? Do you remember? Separation of powers. And that is the end of our video. Just a reminder, teachers, that this lesson is available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Just search for Mr. Raymond's Civics EOC Academy. I want to thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe for more videos coming soon.